Elvis stops mid-song. Drops the microphone. 20,000 people freeze as the king of rock and roll walks toward a crying woman in the third row. The music dies. Security panics. And what happens next will make you believe in the power of human compassion. The date, August 12, 1977. Just 4 days before Elvis would leave this world forever. The Memphis Coliseum was packed beyond capacity. Fans had traveled from across America to witness what nobody knew would be one of the final performances of the greatest entertainer who ever lived. Margaret Thompson sat in row 3, section A, 52 years old. A widow. Her 16-year-old son Michael had been fighting leukemia for 2 years. The doctors had given them 3 weeks. Maybe less. Michael's dying wish wasn't to meet a president or see the Grand Canyon. It was simple: hear Elvis Presley sing, "Love Me Tender," one more time before the pain took away his ability to hear music. But Michael was too weak to travel. So Margaret came alone, carrying her son's hospital bracelet in her purse and a small cassette recorder her neighbor had lent her. She would record Elvis singing Michael's favorite song and play it for him back in the pediatric ward. It was all she could give her dying child. The show was magnificent. Elvis commanded the stage like a force of nature, his white jumpsuit catching the spotlights as he moved through. "Hound dog, don't be cruel," and "All shook up." The audience sang every word, 20,000 voices united in pure joy. But Margaret couldn't sing along. Every note reminded her that her boy would never hear this music again. Every cheer from the crowd amplified the silence that was coming to her home. And when Elvis announced he was about to perform "Love Me Tender," Margaret's composure finally broke. The tears started quietly. Then the sobs came. Deep, wrenching cries that seemed to pull every ounce of grief from her soul. Subscribe now and comment below. In just a moment, you'll see the most incredible part of this story unfold. Elvis had been singing for 20 years. He performed for presidents and paupers, for screaming teenagers and dignified adults. But something about Margaret's cry cut through the noise of 20,000 fans. It wasn't the sound of excitement or hysteria. It was the sound of a mother's heart breaking. He was halfway through the first verse when he heard it. His voice faltered. The backup singers continued, but Elvis's attention had shifted completely. His eyes scanned the crowd until they found her, a middle-aged woman in a simple blue dress, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with grief so raw it was almost physical. Without warning, Elvis stopped singing mid-sentence. The word "tender" hung incomplete in the air. The band continued for exactly 3 more beats before they realized their leader had gone silent. The backup singers' voices trailed off. The bass line faded. 20,000 people who had been swaying and singing suddenly found themselves in complete, bewildered silence. Elvis stepped away from the microphone. Security immediately moved forward, thinking something was wrong with their performer. But Elvis raised his hand not to signal distress, but to keep everyone back. He walked to the edge of the stage, then kept walking. Down the steps. Into the audience. Fans reached out to touch him as he passed, but Elvis's focus never wavered. He was moving toward row 3 with the purposefulness of a man on a mission. Margaret looked up through her tears to see Elvis Presley walking directly toward her. The crowd around her had gone completely silent, creating a pocket of reverence in the middle of chaos. Elvis knelt down in the aisle next to her seat. 20,000 people watched as the king of rock and roll took off his silk scarf and gently handed it to a grieving mother. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear. "I don't know what's hurting you, but I can see it's breaking your heart. Would you like to tell me about it?" Margaret tried to speak but could only sob. Finally, through broken words, she managed to tell him about Michael. About the leukemia. About the 3 weeks. About how her son's last wish was to hear "Love Me Tender" one more time. Elvis listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood up and looked back toward the stage. The entire Coliseum was waiting. 20,000 people holding their collective breath. But here's the incredible part of this story. The part nobody expected. Elvis didn't return to the stage. Instead, he sat down in the empty seat next to Margaret. Right there in row 3, section A, Elvis Presley began to sing, "Love Me Tender," without a microphone, without amplification, without anything but his voice and his heart. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." His voice, unamplified but somehow carrying throughout the hushed Coliseum, filled the space with a tenderness that no recording had ever captured. Margaret held up her small cassette recorder with trembling hands. The audience began to realize what they were witnessing. This wasn't a performance anymore. This was something sacred. One by one, people began to quietly sing along, their voices joining Elvis's in a 20,000-person lullaby for a dying boy they would never meet. "Love me tender, love me true, all my dreams fulfill." Margaret was crying, but differently now. These weren't tears of despair. These were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of witnessing something miraculous. When Elvis finished the song, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver cross, one of several he always carried. He pressed it into Margaret's hand. "You give this to Michael from me," he said. "And you tell him that Elvis Presley knows he's brave. You tell him that his mama's love is going to carry him wherever he's going next." Elvis stood up, kissed Margaret's forehead gently, and walked back to the stage. The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the wild cheering from earlier. This was reverent appreciation, the kind of applause reserved for moments that transcend entertainment and touch something deeper in the human soul. Elvis returned to the microphone, but he didn't launch into another upbeat number. Instead, he dedicated the rest of the show to all the mothers out there who love their children more than life itself. The performance that followed was different from any Elvis had ever given. There was a weight to his voice, a depth of emotion that seemed to acknowledge the fragility of life and the preciousness of every moment we have together. Share this story and subscribe, because this tale of compassion deserves to be remembered forever. Margaret drove through the night to get back to Memphis General Hospital. She found Michael awake, despite the late hour and the morphine that was supposed to keep him comfortable. "Mom?" he whispered when she entered his room. "Did you really see Elvis?" Instead of answering with words, Margaret pressed play on the cassette recorder. Elvis's voice filled the small hospital room. "Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go." But it wasn't just Elvis's voice. Layered underneath was the sound of 20,000 people singing along, their voices blending in a chorus of love that seemed to wrap around Michael like a warm blanket. Michael listened with his eyes closed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When the song ended, Margaret placed the silver cross in his palm. "Elvis Presley said to tell you that he knows you're brave," she whispered, "and that my love is going to carry you wherever you're going next." Michael held the cross against his chest and slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. He passed away 6 days later, just 2 days after Elvis himself died on August 16, 1977. But in his final days, nurses said Michael would ask his mother to play the Elvis song, the recording from that night in Memphis, over and over again. The silver cross was buried with Michael, at his request. But Margaret kept the silk scarf Elvis had given her, and the cassette recording that captured one of the most beautiful moments in the history of live performance. Years later, Margaret would tell reporters that Elvis didn't just sing to her son that night. He sang to every parent who had ever lost a child, every person who had ever felt alone in their grief, every human being who needed to know that compassion still existed in the world. The Memphis Coliseum show was never officially recorded, but bootleg recordings surfaced years later. Music historians note that Elvis's voice that night had a quality they'd never heard before. A rawness and vulnerability that seemed to strip away all pretense and reveal the man behind the legend. In 1987, exactly 10 years after Elvis's death, the Elvis Presley Foundation established the Love Me Tender program, providing comfort to terminally ill children and their families. The program was inspired directly by the story of Margaret Thompson and her son Michael. Margaret Thompson lived until 1995. In her final interview, given to Memphis Magazine just weeks before her death, she said, "People always ask me what Elvis was really like. They want to know if he was as good as his music, as kind as his image. All I can tell them is this: when a mother was crying, he stopped everything, his show, his career, his obligations to 20,000 paying customers to dry her tears. That's not the action of a performer. That's the action of a man with God in his heart. The silk scarf that Elvis gave Margaret that night is now on display at Graceland, in a special exhibit called Moments of Grace. The placard next to it reads simply, "Sometimes the most important audience is an audience of one." On August 12th every year, fans gather at the Memphis Coliseum, now known as the FedEx Forum, to commemorate what many consider Elvis's greatest performance. Not because of the songs he sang or the showmanship he displayed, but because of the moment he chose: love over spectacle, compassion over entertainment. They call it the night the king became human. But perhaps Margaret Thompson said it best: Elvis Presley didn't just sing to her dying son that night. He reminded 20,000 people what it means to see another person's pain and respond with love. In a world that often feels divided and cold, the story of Elvis and Margaret Thompson endures as proof that kindness is never wasted, that compassion never goes unnoticed, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop what you're doing and care about someone else's pain. That's the true legacy of the king of rock and roll. Not the number of records he sold or the crowds he drew, but the moment he chose to be fully, completely human in front of 20,000 witnesses. In the weeks following Elvis's death, hundreds of letters poured into Graceland from people who had been at the Memphis Coliseum that night. They all told variations of the same story. They had come to see Elvis Presley the entertainer, but they witnessed Elvis Presley the man. And that man had changed them. One letter from a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had been sitting in Section B, read, "I brought my teenage daughter to see Elvis because she was going through a difficult time. When I saw him stop his entire show to comfort that crying mother, I knew my daughter was seeing something more valuable than any concert. She was seeing what real strength looks like. What real masculinity looks like. A man secure enough in himself to show compassion publicly." Another letter came from Dr. James Patterson, a Memphis physician who had been in the VIP section that night. "I've spent my career trying to heal people's bodies. But what Elvis did for that mother, what he did for all of us who witnessed it, that was healing on a different level entirely. He showed us that sometimes the most medical thing you can do is simply acknowledge someone's pain." The ripple effects of that August night continued for decades. Margaret Thompson's story inspired the creation of comfort programs in children's hospitals across the country. Music therapy programs began incorporating the Memphis method, using live, intimate musical performance to connect with patients in crisis. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the thousands of people who were there that night, and carried that memory forward into their own lives. They became the teachers who stayed after school with struggling students, the neighbors who checked on elderly residents, the strangers who stopped to help someone crying on a park bench. They had witnessed what happened when someone with the power to ignore suffering chose instead to acknowledge it. And they never forgot. In 1997, 20 years after that pivotal night, Memphis General Hospital dedicated its new pediatric wing. Above the entrance, etched in bronze, are the words Elvis spoke to Michael Thompson through his mother. "My love is going to carry you wherever you're going next." The dedication ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, many of whom had been at the Coliseum that August night. They weren't there to celebrate Elvis Presley the legend. They were there to honor Elvis Presley the human being who had shown them that true greatness isn't measured by applause, it's measured by the willingness to step off the stage and into someone else's pain. Margaret Thompson's cassette recording was digitally preserved by the Library of Congress in 2007 as part of their American Folk Life collection. The catalog description reads, "This recording captures not just a musical performance, but a moment of profound human connection that transcended the traditional boundaries between performer and audience." When visitors to Graceland see Elvis's silk scarf in the Moments of Grace exhibit, many ask the same question. How do we know this story really happened? The answer is simple. Too many people were there. Too many lives were changed. Too many letters were written. Too many similar acts of kindness followed in the years after. The story of Elvis and Margaret Thompson has become more than just a memory. It has become a template for how we might all choose to live, with our eyes open to others' pain and our hearts ready to respond with love. That's the true legacy of the king of rock and roll. Not the number of records he sold or the crowds he drew, but the moment he chose to be fully, completely human in front of 20,000 witnesses. The moment he showed us all that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop everything and care. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of legacy we all should strive to leave behind.